About 18 months ago, I made a new friend. It was a lady named Grace. She was in her early 60s, and when I met her, she was dying of terminal cancer. Grace had been at my church for some time, but we hadn't really overlapped. And I introduced myself when I knew that she was dying. We started to get to know each other. Grace came from Malaysia originally. She was Malaysian of Chinese origin. And when she was in Sunday school age 5, she'd met a Malaysian boy of Indian origin called Ravi, and they had gone on to get married, and essentially had sort of been together for as long as either of them could remember. They traveled all over the world with Ravi's job, and in particular spent several years in London. And while they were in London, Ravi was diagnosed with a heart condition, and the doctor said, it's okay, we can do a very standard surgery on you, 97% survival rate, and we'll have you all sorted out. Turned out Ravi was in the 3%, and so Grace lost her beloved husband. That was about 10 years before she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And when I first had lunch with Grace, she said to me, I haven't once prayed for healing. She said, I prayed for courage in the face of what I know is coming and the suffering, the long drawn-out process that dying of cancer involves. But I haven't prayed for healing. She said to me, do you think that's okay? I said, yeah, I think it's okay. I'm so glad my talk's going with a bang. You see, Grace hadn't prayed for healing because she actually felt quite ready, even though she's relatively young in Western terms to die, she felt very ready to meet Jesus. Now, I don't know what you think about Jesus today and whether that story about Grace makes you think, well, that's lovely for her that she had that delusion that gave her comfort in the face of death. But honestly, today, as 21st century Oxford-educated Westerners, we can't really take that kind of thinking seriously. Like maybe that's how you feel today. Maybe you feel sort of one step further than that actually as you look at the history of the world, and as you look at all the evil things that have been done in the name of religion around the world, and perhaps even evil things that you've witnessed in your own lives done by religious people, you're thinking, honestly, are we not just better off without religion? Now, religion's one of those funny words. It's actually a little bit like the word philosophy, where it's almost impossible to make a statement about religion and it actually be coherent. If we change the topic to, aren't we better off without philosophy? You guys would say, well, wait a minute, which philosophy are you talking about? And so in order to sort of narrow down this question for today of aren't we better off without religion, I want to ask the more specific question, are we better off without Christianity? Now, why am I picking Christianity rather than Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism, any of the other great world religions? The answer is because actually Christianity is the most widespread belief system in the world today, and it is the most diverse. So if we're going to look at one religion, we're going to pick one sort of somewhat at random, then Christianity would actually be the top of the list in terms of having the most impact around the world. And I want to make 4 points in our time today, all of which will be controversial. And so I look forward to Q&A afterwards, and even personally, if you want to meet up later in the week to talk through some stuff. But the points I want to make are this. Number 1, Christianity is good for you. Number 2, Christianity is good for us. Number 3, Christianity defines goodness. And number 4, Christianity might just be true. So number 1, Christianity is good for you. Like I said, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and so 2 major world universities are in my backyard. One is Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and the other is Harvard. And I kind of feel about Harvard like you guys feel about Cambridge, yucky, disgusting, stupid stuff. But I'm going to tell you something about a professor at Harvard, because there's a guy at Harvard School of Public Health whose name is Tyler Vanderveel. He actually spent some years studying at Oxford, so you can kind of claim him as your own. And he runs a group at Harvard School of Public Health that is looking at the mental and physical health implications of regular religious practice. So, for instance, going to church once a week or more. Now, many people of my generation, and probably of yours as well, have been raised to think that formal religion, organized religion, going to church or going to synagogue or going to mosque, it is probably sort of psychologically bad for you. And that maybe, perhaps you were raised in a religious home and you've gone off to university and thought, at last now, I don't have to be doing that stuff anymore. And I'll probably go on to live a happier and psychologically healthier life if I leave religion behind. But it turns out that according to literally the world experts on this at Harvard, that is precisely the opposite of the truth. In fact, it turns out that people who go to church once a week or more are happier, healthier, and longer lived than their secular peers. Now, let's talk for a second first about mental health. It turns out that people who are actively religious, as I say, going to church once a week or more, have lower levels of depression, higher levels of happiness and optimism, much, much lower levels of suicidal ideation and attempts. It's actually, Tyler says that being actively religious is the best protection against suicide that we know of. Whether it's true or not, I'm leaving aside for a minute, but it turns out that they studied a large cohort of women in America and found that women who went to church once a week or more were 5 times less likely to kill themselves than women who never went. They're also less likely to die other kinds of deaths of despair, so for example, deaths from alcoholism or deaths from drug abuse. So massive mental health benefits to regular religious participation. And most of the studies have been done on people who are going to church, just because that's the majority of religious people in America. You can actually see similar results for people who are going to Jewish services, for instance. But what does matter is that these are religious services. They're compared to secular gatherings. So, for example, if you played golf every week with the same group of people, they found that the kind of sort of social support that you'd gain from that accounts for about a quarter of the effect on people's mental and physical health that regular religious participation delivers. So it seems like there's something specific going on with religious participation. And oddly, it's not even just mental health, it's actually physical health as well. You are less likely to die of a heart attack in a certain period of time if you are regularly going to religious services. Your mortality rate is actually sort of substantially lower, which is weird, right? We all know that we should eat more fruits and vegetables. I do, at least. Maybe you guys are very good at this. It turns out that eating more fruits and vegetables or starting to go to church once a week or more is just sort of similar health bump. We all know that smoking is bad for us, but it turns out that stopping smoking and starting to go to church once a week, also similar sort of health benefit. So if you're smoking, you want to keep smoking, that's fine. Just start going to church and you kind of balance out. Maybe that's not quite how it works, but you know what I mean. So it turns out that Christianity is just, in very objective terms, good for you. My second point is that Christianity is good for us. Now, what do I mean by that? We're all painfully aware, as I said, of the ways that religious people have acted throughout history and around the world, and perhaps even in our kind of local environments. I know extremely kind and generous atheists, and I know highly religious people who are, frankly, very unpleasant. So my point is not to say, and please be very careful to hear me on this, my point is not to say, I'm a Christian, and if you're not, I'm better than you are. Actually, one of the basic beliefs of the Christian faith is that Christians like me are so bad that we needed God's own Son to die for us. But if you look at the research in terms of people's pro-social behavior, what you find is that actively religious people are actually more pro-social and less antisocial than secular folks. Again, I'm going to quote some statistics from America just because that's where a lot of the research is done. It turns out that people who go to church once a week or more give 3.5 times as much money away to charity as their secular friends. They volunteer twice as much. They're half as likely to engage in domestic violence. They're less likely to commit at least 43 crimes that have been studied. It's probably more than that. 43 is an odd number. But it seems that in terms of criminal behavior, being actively religious makes you less likely to end up committing crimes. Now, how do I know this is definitely true? Well, even your own Richard Dawkins, former professor of the public understanding of science here, who, at least in my generation, I don't know, is Richard Dawkins even talked about much these days? Yeah, a little bit. Okay, good for him. he and the new atheists who were sort of most active about 20 years ago, really hanging their hats on scientific evidence for all sorts of things. And even he, in one of his recent books, Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide, designed to help young people shed their religious belief, had to acknowledge the evidence that people who believe in God are actually less likely to do antisocial things and more likely to do pro-social things. Now he says, he thinks that religious belief in general, Christianity in particular, is ridiculous. And so he says, it seems rather patronizing to say, well, of course, educated people like you and me couldn't possibly believe in God, but we think it would be a good idea if other people did. He thinks that's patronizing, and I think he's right. But the reality is, if you are a properly, just fully rational atheist who doesn't believe in God, you should hope that most people in your society do for the general good of society. So that's the second point. Christianity is good for us. My third point is this, that Christianity defines goodness. Now, if I were to sit down with every person in this room, then I'm willing to bet that regardless of how you identify religiously, whether you'd say you're a Christian, an atheist, agnostic, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, my guess is that I could sit down with you and say, you and I have some basic moral beliefs that we share. You and I both believe that all human beings are sort of fundamentally equal in value. We all believe that men and women are equal in value. We all believe that people of different racial backgrounds are equally valuable, and that love across racial difference is actually a good thing. We all believe that the strong and the rich and the powerful don't have the right to trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalized, but instead that they should be protected. We all think that rape is wrong. We all think that it would be evil to leave a newborn baby out in the street to die or to be picked up and raised as a slave. We think today in our Western culture that these are self-evident beliefs. They're just like basic moral common sense. You don't need any religious foundation for those kinds of beliefs, right? Actually wrong. There's a British historian called Tom Holland who wrote a fat book, it's about this thick, called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. He grew up in a sort of vaguely Anglican family, but stopped believing in the Christian God when he was a kid. He was actually far more attracted by the Greek and Roman gods than by the seemingly pathetic hero of Christianity. But a number of years ago, he started researching for this book that's looking at the history of Christianity in the last 2,000 years in the West in particular. And what he discovered was that beliefs that he as an agnostic held to be self-evident moral truths turned out to be specifically Christian beliefs. Now, how is it then that today you could sit down with a friend in the bar who identifies as atheist and he or she would very likely hold these exact same beliefs? Well, it's partly because of a very deliberate decision that was made in the outcome, the sort of horrific outcomes of the Second World War that prompted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, if you look closely, turns out to be Christian ethics clothed in secular garments to make it more acceptable to countries that might not have a majority Christian history. But Tom Holland points out, actually, awkwardly, when you look closely, they are specifically Christian beliefs. So some of the things that we hold most dear and see as most self-evident truths morally turn out to be Christian truths. And when we pull Christianity out of the foundation, it's not like, I don't know if you ever played Jenga, where you sort of pile up the tower. You're looking blank. Does Jenga exist over here? Okay, good. You sort of make this tower out of blocks, and you're trying to inch out a little block from the bottom and build a higher moral tower. If you pull Christianity out of the moral foundations, you don't actually end up being able to make a higher moral tower. It's more like pulling the pin on a grenade. Actually, everything kind of goes up in the explosion. So that's the third point. Christianity defines goodness. And lastly, Christianity might just be true. As I mentioned at the beginning, the reason I'm talking about Christianity, aside from the fact that I'm more qualified to talk on it than I am to talk on Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism, is that Christianity today is the most widespread belief system in the world. And it's really interesting that that's the case, because 40 years ago, most sociologists of religion thought that as the world became more educated, more scientific, more modern, that religious belief would naturally decline. This is what had happened in Western Europe. And so the argument went, well, Western Europe led, the rest of the world must follow, right? Wrong. In the last 40 years, not only has religious belief failed to decline globally, but now as experts look out over the next 40 years to sort of 2060, they're anticipating an increasingly religious world. So right now, about 31% of the world's population identifies as Christian, and that proportion is set to increase slightly to 32% by 2060. Islam, the second largest belief system in the world, is set to go up from about 25% to 31%, making it a very close competitor with Christianity. Buddhism and Hinduism are both expected to decline slightly. But here's the real shock. The proportion of people who don't identify with any major religion, so that includes atheists, agnostics, and people who would just sort of tick none on a census form if you were asked, what are your religious beliefs? That proportion is set to decline from 15% to 13% between now and 2060. It very likely feels to you, living where you do, in this sort of little corner of the West, like religious belief in general and Christianity in particular is kind of on the way out. But actually that turns out to be a very parochial and very white Western-focused way of thinking. In fact, as I said, Christianity continues to be the largest and the most diverse belief system in the world. I'm going to talk later this week about diversity. And I think in many people's minds, Christianity is sort of opposed to diversity. Turns out Christianity is the first and best foundation for diversity that we have, but more of that on Wednesday, I think. 2,000 years ago, when this wandering Jewish rabbi known as Jesus of Nazareth was executed on a Roman cross, it would have seemed like all his claims were frankly disproved. This man had claimed that he was the son of the one true creator God. That he was, in fact, the king, the rightful king of all the world, not just of the Jews, but actually of every person from every tribe and tongue and nation around the world, that he was the rightful king. And yet there he was, brutally executed by the Romans. That was what the Romans did to people to prove their utter failure. It was a death usually reserved for slaves, but also sometimes for rebels. People who had the gall to stand up to Rome got crucified. Now, from a Greek and Roman perspective, the idea that a human being was also divine wouldn't have been completely out of their way of thinking. If you were a powerful emperor, you could be worshipped as Son of God, and you could be worshipped even after your death as divine. But it would have seemed utterly ridiculous to Greek and Romans that a man who never wrote a book or sat on a throne or led an army, and he was in fact crucified, dying this shameful and humiliating death, to claim that he was the Son of God who should be worshipped, completely ridiculous. But then his followers, much even to their surprise, despite the fact that Jesus had actually predicted this, that he was going to die and that he was going to rise again, some women, a few days after Jesus was crucified, went to his tomb to sort of put embalming ointments on him, and found not only the tomb was empty, but they actually they claimed that they had met Jesus in the flesh. And suddenly this small group of a few dozen heartbroken, dispirited Jews who'd been followers of Jesus started going around proclaiming that Jesus was the Christ, God's promised king, that he had been raised from the dead and that one day he was going to come back again. And if we look now, 2,000 years later, the claim that Jesus is in fact the rightful king of all the world looks actually a lot less absurd. Because if you were to ask people around the world today, who is the rightful king? The most common response that you would get from, as I say, about almost a third of humanity is Jesus of Nazareth. Now, this doesn't prove that Christianity is true, of course. But what I'm hoping it does, if you're someone who maybe was raised in a somewhat religious home, or maybe was raised, as several of my friends have been, in like completely secular homes, thinking that Christianity isn't even worth looking at. Maybe it makes it worth just looking again to see whether Christianity might just be true. In the last sort of minute or so that I have here before we do some Q&A, I'm just going to sketch out what that basic message of Christianity is, because I think people often have sort of an idea of what Christians are claiming. It's not always what Jesus actually said. So that the claim of the Christian faith is that there is a God who made all of us. We're going to talk about science tomorrow if you want to come back for that. That he made the whole universe, and that he made each of us in particular. And that he made humans in his image. That in some way we resemble this God who made the universe. But that every single one of us has rejected God. We've actually turned away from him. And that we have come under God's righteous judgment. Again, that's a highly unpopular way of thinking today. We all think we're probably sort of basically morally good. According to Jesus, we're basically morally bad. But the good news is that according to Jesus, every single person in this room is so profoundly loved that Jesus thought you were worth dying for. Jesus thought, rather than having you face God's judgment, that he would face God's judgment in your place. And that any one of us who puts our trust in Jesus can be, not only have our sin forgiven, but be welcomed by him into everlasting life. I mentioned my friend Grace, who ended up dying a few months ago. And a few weeks before she died, she was talking with her daughter. And her daughter said, Mum, I like to think of heaven as the place where we'll see Papa again. And my friend Grace said, I think we're setting our sights too low. She wasn't looking forward primarily to being reunited with her beloved husband, who she'd known since she was 5 and who she'd deeply missed for 10 years. She was primarily looking forward to meeting with Jesus face to face. The real question for each of us today is, are we better off without Jesus? And I deeply believe that the answer is no.